It was never supposed to continue. Years ago, the Perron family left that farmhouse behind. The doors were closed, the memories buried, and the world moved on. But what if the story didn't end there? What if the haunting didn't stop, it just changed form? What you are about to hear is not just a retelling. This is an update. New reflections. New interviews. And most importantly, new questions that still don't have answers. Before we go any further, if you are fascinated by real horror, unexplained mysteries, and cases that blur the line between reality and fear, make sure you subscribe to the Grim Tapes. Because the deeper we go, the darker things get. Now let's return to a place that should have faded into silence, but didn't. The Perron family case is often remembered through dramatization, especially after it inspired one of the most famous paranormal films ever made. But behind the cinematic version lies a far more complex, emotional, and deeply unsettling reality. Years after the original events, the surviving members of the family began speaking again. Not to relive the horror, but to understand it. Time had passed. They had grown older. Their perspectives had changed. And with that, came reflections that were even more disturbing than the original experiences. Andrea Perron, one of the daughters, has spoken extensively about what happened inside that farmhouse. But what makes her later interviews so chilling is not just what she describes, it's how she describes it. She no longer speaks like someone telling a ghost story. She speaks like someone who lived alongside something intelligent. According to her, the presence in the house was never just random activity. It was calculated, observant, aware. In early reflections, the family described classic paranormal signs. Objects moving. Strange sounds. Cold spots. But in later interviews, Andrea emphasizes something different. Patterns. She recalls how certain events would happen at specific times. How certain family members were targeted more than others. How the energy in the house seemed to shift depending on mood, tension, and even fear. This raises a disturbing possibility. What if the haunting wasn't chaotic, but controlled? Another major revelation from follow-up discussions is how differently each family member experienced the same house. Some felt terror. Others felt watched. And a few felt something that's much harder to explain. Connection. One of the daughters described moments where the presence didn't feel hostile. It felt curious. Almost as if it was studying them. Think about that. Not attacking. Not scaring. Studying. As the years went on, the family began to question whether what they experienced could even be categorized as a traditional haunting. Because it didn't behave like one. There were no clear rules. No predictable escalation. Instead, it felt like something adapting. One of the most unsettling parts of the follow-up interviews is how memory itself became unreliable. Andrea has mentioned that certain events became clearer over time, while others faded in strange ways. This is not typical. Usually, trauma either dulls or intensifies memory consistently. But in this case, it's almost as if some memories were suppressed. Or hidden. Why would that happen? Was it psychological? Or was something influencing how those memories were processed? Another layer added in recent reflections is the emotional impact that lasted long after the family left the house. Many people assume that once a haunted location is abandoned, the effects disappear. But according to the Perron family, that wasn't the case. The fear didn't stay in the house. It followed them. Andrea describes periods in her later life where certain sounds, certain smells, even certain lighting conditions would trigger intense reactions. Not just fear, but recognition. As if something familiar was trying to reach back into her life. Now ask yourself this. Can a place haunt you, even after you leave it? Or does the haunting attach itself to something else? Something inside you? Another chilling detail that emerged in follow-up interviews is the way the family now views the entity often associated with the house. In earlier accounts, it was described with fear and hostility. But later reflections suggest something more complicated. Not evil in the traditional sense, but not human either. Andrea has hinted that labeling it as simply bad might be an oversimplification. Instead, she suggests that what they encountered may have been something with its own logic, its own awareness, and its own purpose. And that purpose may not have been to harm. It may have been to exist through them. Let that sink in. One of the most debated aspects of the case in modern discussions is how much of it can be explained through psychology. Skeptics argue that isolation, stress, and suggestion could have influenced the family's perception. But here's where the follow-up interviews complicate that argument. Years later, separated from each other, with different lives and experiences, the family members still describe events in ways that align. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to raise questions. If it was all imagination, why does it still match? Another fascinating angle explored in recent reflections is how the family now interprets fear itself. At the time, they were terrified. That's undeniable. But looking back, Andrea suggests that fear may have amplified the activity. As if whatever was in the house fed on it. Not in a literal sense, but in a reactive one. Fear created energy. And that energy may have made the presence stronger. Which leads to an even darker question. What would have happened if they weren't afraid? Would the haunting have weakened? Or would it have escalated in a completely different way? One of the most emotional parts of the follow-up comes from the family's reflections on their parents. Living in that house didn't just affect the children. It deeply impacted the adults as well. Their mother, in particular, is often remembered as being more sensitive to the presence. But in later interviews, there's a sense that she may have understood more than she ever said. Andrea has suggested that her mother may have held back certain truths to protect the children. If that's true, then what exactly did she know? And why was it too dangerous to share? As the years passed, the Perron family's story shifted from a haunting to a mystery that still hasn't been solved. Not because there's no evidence, but because the evidence doesn't point to a clear conclusion. Instead, it leaves behind fragments, experiences, memories, and questions that refuse to go away. Now think about this carefully. If multiple people experience something over a long period of time and continue to stand by it years later, at what point does it stop being just a story and start becoming something else? Something real, but not fully understood. As you listen to these reflections, you have to decide where you stand. Do you believe the Perron family encountered something truly paranormal? Or do you think their minds created something powerful enough to feel real? And here's the most important question of all. If you were placed in that house, with no knowledge of its history, would you experience the same things? Or would it stay silent, waiting for the right moment? Before we move deeper into the next part of this case, where we examine new interpretations, overlooked details, and the theories that might finally explain what really happened, take a moment and think. Not about ghosts. Not about fear. But about perception. Because sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what we see. It's what we can't explain, even when it's right in front of us. And as we continue, the line between reality and imagination is only going to get thinner.